They didn't ask his name. They didn't ask what he needed. They just looked at his coat, his skin, and the cracks in his shoes, and decided he didn't belong. The security guard didn't hesitate. He put his hand on the old man's shoulder before he even reached the front desk. The receptionist rolled his eyes. A young woman behind the counter whispered something under her breath and laughed, loud enough to make sure he heard. And then they pushed him, out the door, into the cold, just another unwanted man. But what they didn't know, what none of them bothered to find out, was that the man they humiliated was a man who built that bank from nothing. He wasn't just a customer. He was a founder, the one who once dreamed of a place that would never turn people away for looking less than. His name was Franklin D. Holloway, a decorated war veteran, a Harvard-educated economist, and a man who, over 40 years ago, built Midtown Mutual Trust with little more than a dream and a battered notebook. He didn't come back for a reunion. He came back to see if the thing he built still remembered what it stood for, and what he found was silence, dismissal, disrespect. And as Franklin stepped back into the wind, sat down on a bench across the street, and opened his notebook, the one he carried with him through every branch visit, every quiet test, every lonely walk-in, he wrote something down. They saw a coat, not a man, not a name, not a legacy, just a coat. It wasn't the first time this had happened, and he knew it wouldn't be the last. Franklin Holloway hadn't worn a suit in weeks. He didn't shave that morning, didn't comb his beard. His coat was 10 years old and thinning at the elbows. His shoes had scuffs from winters long gone, and the strap on his satchel had been repaired 3 times by his own hand. Everything about him looked like a man forgotten by the world, and that was the point. He had spent over 4 decades building a life, a name, a reputation. He had built a bank with his own hands. Midtown Mutual Trust, it was called back then, started with just 2 folding chairs and a desk made from a hollow corridor laid across cinder blocks. He had opened it in a neighborhood no other bank wanted, helped families no other lenders would touch, approved loans that made sense not just on paper, but in real life. Franklin didn't see numbers. He saw people. But over time, the board changed. The culture shifted. Midtown Mutual Trust became Midtown National Bank. The name got shorter, and so did the patience for those who didn't wear tailored suits or drive the right kind of car. So Franklin left, not because he was pushed out, but because he couldn't recognize the thing he built anymore. And for a while, he watched from a distance. He watched as fees rose, as waiting rooms got colder, as smiles became less real, and eventually, as kindness turned into performance, until one day, he decided to come back, but not as Franklin Holloway, the respected founder, not with cameras or interviews or red carpets. He wanted to see what happened to the people no one noticed, so he dressed like them. He walked into a branch in Chicago, looking like a tired old man with nowhere to go. No one offered him a seat. The manager looked past him. A teller told him he'd be more comfortable at a shelter down the block. In Atlanta, it was worse. A guard followed him from the entrance to the exit, hand hovering near his hip the entire time. No one said hello. No one asked why he was there. One customer even asked if he was lost. He was not in the city, in his own legacy. But Cincinnati was supposed to be different, because Cincinnati was where it all started. The branch sat on the corner of Main and Elm, a sleek glass building that gleamed in the early morning light. He had picked the stone for the lobby himself. He'd walked these halls with a hard hat when it was just steel and dust. He'd written the mission statement, the one still engraved in brass on the wall. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be seen. Franklin smiled to himself as he pushed to the front doors, that old satchel slung over his shoulder. The warmth of the lobby hit him right away. Polished marble floors, faint jazz music, the scent of lemon cleaner. 2 tellers behind the counter, 1 receptionist, 1 security guard. All eyes turned to him. None of them smiled. The receptionist, a young man with slick back hair and too much cologne, didn't stand. Instead, he leaned back in his chair and said, "Can I help you with something?" "Yes," Franklin said gently. "I'd like to speak with the branch manager, The receptionist blinked, annoyed. "Do you have an appointment?" "No, but I believe he'll want to see me." The young man stared at him for a second, then shook his head. "Sir, I'm going to need you to step aside. This desk is for clients. I am a client." He didn't raise his voice. He didn't frown. He simply stood still, shoulders squared, as if the walls themselves recognized him, even if the people inside didn't. That's when the guard walked over. He was tall, maybe in his 40s, with a buzz cut and a voice like gravel. "Sir, I'm going to need you to leave." Franklin turned to him. "I haven't done anything wrong." "You're making staff uncomfortable." "How?" "You're standing here. You're loitering. You don't look like a customer." Franklin's voice was soft. And what does a customer look like? That was the moment everything shifted. The guard placed a heavy hand on Franklin's arm and said, "We've had trouble with people like you. So unless you're here to make a deposit, I need you out." A pause. Then the receptionist added, without looking up, "Try the credit union downtown. They might have something more your speed." Franklin looked around. The brass plaque was still there, mounted on the far wall. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be seen." He turned back to the guard. "I built this place," he said quietly, 41 years ago. But the guard didn't hear him, or didn't care. Instead, he shoved the old man toward the door. And when Franklin's satchel fell to the floor and the papers scattered like feathers in a storm, no one bent down to help. Not the receptionist. Not the guard who had just shoved him. Not the bank manager, watching from behind a glass wall. One woman glanced over from the waiting area and quickly looked away. Franklin slowly knelt down, his knees stiff from age, his back aching from years of labor. He gathered each sheet with quiet hands. Hands that had signed the founding documents of this very branch. Hands that once held the hammer to build a foundation it stood on. Now, trembling, not from weakness, but from the weight of what this place had become. A faded photograph slid across the floor. It was a black and white picture of him, younger, standing in front of a tiny storefront, arms folded, smiling. Midtown Mutual Trust, 1984. One of the tellers stepped on the photo as she walked by, didn't notice, didn't care. Franklin picked it up last, brushed off the soul-shaped smudge, and slipped it gently back into his notebook. Then he stood, straightened the old coat draped across his shoulders, and walked out without a word. No one stopped him. No one called after him. The door closed behind him like a quiet betrayal. Outside, the air felt sharper than before. It wasn't just the wind. It was something deeper. A coldness that didn't come from weather, but from people. From the way dignity could be erased in seconds. He crossed the street, sat down on the same bench he had chosen that morning, and placed a notebook on his lap. He didn't open it right away. For a long moment, he just stared at the building in silence. It gleamed in the sunlight, glass and steel and shallow smiles behind digital screens. So much had changed, and yet so little had. Finally, he opened the notebook and turned to a fresh page. At the top, he wrote, "Cincinnati Flagship Branch. I built it brick by brick. Now they treat me like I never existed." He paused, then wrote something slower, heavier. "If this is how they treat me, I can only imagine how they treat those without a voice." That was always the point, wasn't it? Franklin hadn't come back for himself. He didn't need money. He didn't need a loan. He wasn't some angry old man with a grudge. He was here to see the truth. To see if Midtown National still remembered the mission it was built on. A mission he had written on a yellow legal pad 41 years ago, when he was just another black veteran who couldn't get a loan, who was told to try maintenance work, instead of dreaming too big. He remembered that day. The banker's smirk, the fake courtesy, the way they spoke about people like you without saying it outright. Franklin didn't raise his voice back then, either. He simply walked out, bought a notebook, and wrote down, "If they won't help me build it, I'll build it without them." And he did. He took warehouse jobs, cleaned toilets, skipped meals, and saved every dollar. He borrowed nothing, asked no one for favors, just kept working until he had enough to rent a tiny storefront near a bus station and open the first branch of Midtown Mutual Trust. He didn't have computers back then. Just a ledger, a calculator, and a coffee pot he kept full for anyone who came in, especially on cold mornings like this one. He remembered Marlene, the single mom with 2 kids and no credit history, who came in needing $300 for a used car. She looked defeated, like she'd already been told no too many times. Franklin had said yes, not because she had collateral, but because she had a job, a heart, and a reason to keep moving forward. And she paid it back, with interest. And every month after, she came in to deposit $20 into a savings account for her daughter. That was the mission, not to protect money, but to restore dignity. That was the bank Franklin built. But somewhere along the way, the mission was lost, replaced by policies, protocols, polished smiles that faded when no one important was looking. Franklin saw it happening, slowly at first, then all at once. After he stepped down, they removed Mutual from the name, dropped the community workshops, replaced the coffee pot with a touchscreen kiosk. He let it go for a while. He figured maybe it was just the way things were now. But when he started hearing stories from customers, from friends, from people who used to be proud to walk into a midtown branch, something inside him stirred. Then the stories became letters. Then the letters became visits. Chicago, Atlanta, St. Louis. He went in quietly. No fanfare. Just an old man in an old coat. And each time, they looked at him the same way they had today. Like he didn't belong. Like he didn't matter. But today had crossed a line. Because this was the original branch. The one he poured his soul into. And they had thrown him out of it like a stranger. He flipped to the last page of the notebook and stared at it for a long time. Then in small, careful print he wrote, "Tomorrow I come back. Not as a ghost. Not as a lesson. But as the man who built it all." The next morning, the sky over Cincinnati was clear. No rain. No fog. Just a pale sun hanging low over Main Street, lighting the bank's glass facade like nothing had ever gone wrong inside. But something was different. People noticed him this time. Franklin Holloway didn't walk with his head down. He didn't with a torn coat or the scuffed shoes. He stepped out of a quiet black car, straightened the lapel of his dark wool overcoat, and walked toward the front doors of Midtown National Bank, like a man with nothing to prove. And in truth, he didn't. Inside the lobby, the same receptionist from yesterday looked up. At first, he didn't recognize him. Why would he? This man didn't look poor. This man looked like he might own a few companies. But then recognition crept in like a shadow. The man blinked, then sat up straighter. Franklin didn't stop at the desk. He kept walking. Each step echoed on the marble. The guard, Travis, step 4 out habit, but something in his body hesitated. He remembered the man's face now. Yesterday, he saw a nobody. Today, he saw someone who just might matter. "Sir," he said carefully, "can I help?" "You already did," Franklin replied, without even glancing at him. The elevator opened as if on cue. Franklin stepped inside, alone. No one asked where he was going, but everyone watched. Upstairs, behind polished glass, branch manager Ronald Barnes was reviewing spreadsheets when his assistant knocked once, opened the door halfway, and whispered, "There's someone here to see you. Says it's urgent." Ronald didn't even look up. "Unless it's compliance. I don't want to be bothered." "It's Franklin Holloway," she said. That got his attention. He stood up slowly, adjusting the cuffs of his shirt. "Send him in." When Franklin walked through the door, Ronald moved around the desk to greet him with a practiced smile. The kind that said, "I'm happy to see you," even when he wasn't. "Mr. Holloway," he said, extending his hand. "It's an honor." Franklin looked at the hand, then shook it briefly. "Is that what we're calling it today?" he asked softly. Ronald didn't answer. "Let's not waste time," Franklin continued. "I'd like to speak with your staff. All of them. Right now. In the main conference room." Ronald hesitated. "Is there something I can assist with directly?" "I've already been assisted," Franklin said. "Very thoroughly. Now it's time we talk." 15 minutes later, every employee from the front desk to the loan department stood around the long wooden table in the glass-walled conference room. A few shifted uncomfortably. Others stood stiffly, arms crossed, pretending they weren't nervous. The receptionist was there. So was Travis. So was Evelyn Marks, the assistant manager who had watched from behind a glass wall the day before and done nothing. Franklin stood at the head of the table. He didn't yell. He didn't slam his fist. He didn't need to. He simply placed his notebook on the table and opened it. "This," he said quietly, "is a record of every branch I visited in the past year. Chicago, Atlanta, St. Louis, and yesterday here." He flipped the pages slowly, revealing hand-drawn notes, customer observations, and a list of names. Some names were underlined. Some had red marks next to them. "I came into this bank yesterday. Some of you remember. Some of you laughed. Some of you looked away. One of you put your hands on me and pushed me out the door." Travis looked down at the floor. "No one asked my name," Franklin continued. "No one asked why I was here. Not one person offered help when my bag spilled open. Not one of you read the plaque on the wall behind you." He pointed toward the hallway outside, where the brass plaque still hung. "Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be seen." "I wrote those words," Franklin said, his voice catching slightly. "And none of you saw me." Evelyn stepped forward. "Mr. Holloway, I'm so sorry. I didn't realize." "Exactly," he cut in. "You didn't realize. Because in your mind, I wasn't someone worth realizing." The silence was heavy now. He turned to the receptionist. "You laughed. I heard you." "I didn't mean anything by it," the young man mumbled. "No, you meant exactly what you said. You just didn't expect the man you were mocking to have a name." He turned to Travis. "You put your hands on me." Travis swallowed hard. "I was just doing my job, sir." "No," Franklin said. "You were doing what you thought you had the right to do. You saw an old black man in an old coat, and you decided I didn't belong." He paused. "Tell me something, Mr. Barnes," Franklin said, turning to the branch manager. "If I hadn't come back today in this suit, if I had just stayed on that bench, would you have ever known what your team did yesterday?" Ronald shook his head slowly. "No, I wouldn't have." Franklin looked at every face in the room. "I didn't come back for an apology. I don't need one. What I came for was the truth." He tapped the notebook once. "And now I have it." He turned to leave. But just as he reached the door, he stopped, then said quietly without turning around, "The next time someone walks in who doesn't look the way you expect, don't just ask what they want. Ask who they are." He left the room in silence. No one followed him. Not at first. But as he passed the front desk, one employee, a young woman who hadn't spoken at all, stepped forward. "I'm sorry, Mr. Holloway," she said, her voice trembling. "I didn't say anything yesterday. I wanted to, but I froze. I knew it was wrong." Franklin looked at her kindly. "You didn't fail me," he said. "You failed yourself. But the good news is you can still fix that." Then he walked out the door into the same morning air as the day before. Only now the whole city was watching. By noon, the story had broken. A local journalist had caught wind of the incident and published an article titled, "Bank Founder Thrown Out His Own Building," because he looked homeless. The headline spread like wildfire. Photos circulated. Franklin in his coat, being escorted out. Franklin in a suit, addressing the staff. Franklin sitting alone on the bench across the street, notebook in hand. News stations picked it up. Talk shows called. Civil rights groups issued statements. Customers threatened to close their accounts. Protesters gathered quietly outside the branch with signs that read, "Dignity first. Look deeper. We are Franklin." But Franklin didn't speak to the cameras. He didn't go on the morning shows. He didn't write an open letter. Instead, he wrote in his notebook, one last page, and on it just 10 words. "They forgot who I was. I reminded them why." The news didn't just spread. It shook something loose. What happened to Franklin Holloway inside Midtown National Bank didn't stay inside those walls, because the world outside had been waiting for a story that finally said out loud what so many had felt quietly for years. It began with whispers on social media. Then the news article went viral. By that evening, Hashtags were trending nationwide. Hashtag respect has no dress code. Hashtag we are Franklin. Hashtag dignity first. Franklin's name was on every major news outlet. Not as a victim, not even as a founder, but as a mirror, a living, breathing reminder of how easily institutions forget the people who built them. And when the surveillance footage was leaked, the moment the guard laid his hand on Franklin's arm, the way he stumbled slightly, the way the receptionist laughed when his papers scattered across the floor, the country watched and didn't look away. The next morning, the CEO of Midtown National Bank, a man Franklin had never met, stood before a sea of reporters. He didn't smile. He didn't posture. He looked like a man who knew the world had just changed under his feet. "I want to begin by saying this clearly," he said. "What happened to Mr. Holloway in our flagship branch, no less, was a failure, not just of policy, but of purpose." He paused. "This is not who we say we are, and it is not who we will continue to be." He promised immediate steps. Full review of branch-level training, suspension of involved staff, community listening sessions, and most notably, a request that Mr. Franklin D. Holloway return to speak, not just to the board, but to the entire organization. Franklin didn't respond immediately. He didn't crave attention. He hadn't wanted to be a symbol. But symbols weren't always chosen. Sometimes they were earned slowly, painfully, one injustice at a time. He waited a full day before he returned a single call. And when he finally said yes, the board didn't schedule a private meeting. They scheduled a summit, a live-stream company-wide address from the very heart of their national headquarters in Chicago. Every branch, every employee, every executive, all tuned in. Franklin arrived alone. No entourage, no press, just the same satchel, the same notebook. But this time, they opened the door for him. The room was silent when he stepped on stage. Hundreds of eyes watched from the floor, thousands more from across the country. Branch lobbies had shut down operations just to watch. Franklin stood at the podium, looked out over the sea of suits, and began in a voice steady and clear. "I never wanted to give this speech." He let the weight of that truth settle in the room. "I didn't come back to Midtown to make headlines. I came back to see if the house I helped build still had its soul." He opened his notebook and held it up. "This little thing has seen every mistake we've made. It holds the names of people who smiled while dismissing strangers, people who forgot how to listen, people who decided worth based on shoes and coats." He set it down. "But I don't believe this story ends in shame. I believe it begins there." The room didn't move. "I started this bank with a coffee pot, a folding chair, and a promise that people would be seen, not their balances, not their credit scores, them." A few people nodded, quietly. What we lost wasn't just kindness, it was courage. The courage to believe that every person walking through those doors carries something sacred. A story, a struggle, a chance. He paused, then looked directly into the camera. "And to those of you watching from your branches, behind your teller windows, behind your screens, I'm not asking you to recognize me. I'm asking you to recognize yourself in the people who walk in looking tired, unsure, or alone." Silence. Stillness. Then a single clap. Then two. Then the room rose. Not in applause, but in something deeper, respect. Not for a speech, but for the truth inside it. That same week, Midtown announced a sweeping set of reforms, not performative but practical. Every new hire will be required to attend dignity training, modeled directly from Franklin's original founding principles. Every branch manager would spend 1 day per month working the front lobby, not from behind glass, but beside tellers. And most importantly, the brass plaque in every branch, the one Franklin wrote, would be restored to its full original form. Every person who walks through these doors deserves to be seen, heard, and treated with the dignity they carry, whether we see it or not. But the biggest change didn't come from the top. It came from the ground. In Cincinnati, an elderly woman walked into the branch where Franklin had been humiliated. She wore an oversized coat and carried a cloth purse. The receptionist stood when she entered, offered her tea, asked how her day was going. He didn't know her name. Didn't need to. He just remembered And down the street, that same bench Franklin had sat on became something more. A plaque was quietly bolted into the wood. It didn't bear his name. Just one line. Respect isn't earned. It's owed. Franklin never asked for credit. But one evening, weeks later, as the sun slipped behind the skyline, he walked past that bench again, saw the plaque, sat for a while. People passed him. Some recognized him. Some didn't. But that didn't matter, because what he came to fix was already beginning to heal. And that was enough. The noise died down eventually. The hashtag stopped trending. The press turned to newer stories, fresher scandals. But something stayed. The plaque on the bench. The retraining programs. The quiet way tellers across the country started looking people in the eye again. Not because it was policy, but because something inside them had shifted. And Franklin Holloway? He didn't chase any of it. He just went home. Not to a mansion. Not to some gated estate with a fountain in the driveway. Just a modest house at the end of a quiet street, where the mailbox still had his name on it in fading black letters, and the front porch creaked when he stepped on the third board. The kind of house where your neighbors wave when you bring the trash out, where you know the mailman's name, where peace doesn't come from silence, but from meaning. He spent his mornings tending the garden out back. Tomatoes, basil, a few stubborn rose bushes. Sometimes, neighborhood kids would come by and ask him questions, not about banking, about life. And he always had time, because the man they'd seen on the news, the man who stood in front of the most powerful people in the room and said things they couldn't ignore, to them, he was just Mr. Holloway. The quiet man who gave away extra strawberries and always asked how school was going. That was how he liked it. He wasn't trying to be remembered. He was trying to make remembering unnecessary. One day, a letter arrived. No return address. Just a single sheet of paper, handwritten. It said, "My name is Marcus. I'm the receptionist who laughed when you came in that day. I've thought about it every night since. I'm not proud of what I did. I don't expect forgiveness. But I want you to know I stayed. I'm still at the branch. And now, every person who walks in, I greet like they're the most important name on the schedule. Because they might be. Because you were. Thank you for not yelling. Thank you for showing us how blind we become." Franklin folded the letter gently and placed it inside his notebook, next to all the others. It wasn't the first apology, and it wouldn't be the last. But he didn't keep them for pride. He kept them because they meant it worked. The truth had landed. It had made a sound. One morning, months later, Franklin visited the branch again. No cameras. No suit. Just him. He walked through the doors like any customer. The teller on duty didn't hesitate. She smiled, a real smile, and asked, "How can I help you today, sir?" He just looked around the lobby. The coffee pot was back. The plaque was polished. There were new faces at the counter, and a familiar one in the back. Marcus. He didn't say anything, just gave a respectful nod from behind the glass. Franklin nodded back. That was enough. He didn't need a ceremony. He didn't need a ribbon. He just needed to know the door was open again, not just for him, but for everyone like him. Outside, the bench was still there, the plaque still shining. He sat for a while, let the breeze move through the trees. Watch the people pass by, young, old, hurried, tired, distracted, joyful. All of them carrying something invisible, a story, a wound, a hope. And he smiled, because now maybe more people were willing to see that. He opened his notebook one last time, wrote a single line. Dignity restored, not by words, but by action. Then he closed it, for good, not because the work was done, but because it had finally begun. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from titles or threats. It comes from choosing to stay kind, even when others choose not to. It comes from walking back into the places that forgot you, and reminding them what it means to see someone. Franklin Holloway didn't shout. He didn't demand. He simply showed up as the very thing they had stopped believing in, human dignity. Sometimes the most powerful change doesn't come from titles or threats. It comes from choosing to stay kind, even when others choose not to. It comes from walking back into the places that forgot you, and reminding them what it means to see someone. Franklin Holloway didn't shout. He didn't demand. He simply showed up as the very thing they had stopped believing in: human dignity.